Okay, well, thanks for organising this and for coming, those of you who have come. Obviously, it's a meeting taking place at a kind of fairly important moment, because our Donald is already planning his trip. He's going to be in London in less than 2 weeks' time, and then he's obviously coming up this way, heading up this way to play a round of golf, we hear. And as someone who's I've been involved in the kind of, in terms of the London protests, negotiating the various slogans for the demonstration, one of the things that strikes you about Donald Trump is the sheer number of different reasons that people have for protesting against his visit, and it's like there's almost a new one every day. I mean, obviously, the biggest kind of outrage has been his treatment of migrants, but tearing families apart and putting kids in cages and all these kind of things. And then I think it was yesterday the Muslim ban was endorsed by the Supreme Court in the United States. But even since then, he's been saying the most outrageous things as a response to that ruling about sending in the ICE force, as they call it, to grab illegals by their neck and chuck them out of the country. I mean, it's really, obviously the rhetoric is really quite chilling and disturbing. So, I mean, there's a huge amount to talk about when it comes to Trump. I want to focus on, I think, a very important aspect of the abomination that is the Trump regime, which is the kind of toxic international impact that he's been having. And there's all sorts of aspects of that. I think George Bush, I suppose, has got a claim on leading the way in terms of recent history, but perhaps not. There is this sense that what Trump is doing is having an impact right across the globe in a whole number of different ways. One is actually his quite recent sharp turn towards protectionism economically, which in itself is liable to increase tension and confrontation between great powers. Protectionism has the tendency to lead to kind of the hardening of spheres of influence, which also are likely to develop a military aspect very quickly and can spill over into wars in whole numbers of unexpected ways. And protectionism also has a tendency to kind of increase nationalism and xenophobia as well. So, I mean, that's just one part of the picture. Another important part is just his extreme xenophobia, his racist comments, the rhetoric that he pumps out on a systematic daily basis, very often in the early hours of the morning, which has had a really horrible poisonous effect on politics internationally, and is deliberately designed, actually, to shape politics in different ways. And if anyone has any doubts about that, it's worth noting that Steve Bannon, his former advisor and still a close confidant, actually sent a message of support and was probably partly involved in coordinating the Free Tommy Robinson demonstration, sort of far-right demonstration which took place in London a few weeks ago, which was partly funded by the US. And, I mean, Trump himself has been involved in issuing joint statements with people like Viktor Orban, the deeply racist and anti-Semitic Prime Minister of Hungary, a statement that was deliberately designed to attack what they regard as Angela Merkel's overly liberal attitude towards migrants, and called for hardening of borders around the world. This is a very deliberate policy of trying to shape politics, trying to enable far-right organisations and individuals in different parts of the world. And I think that has had... I mean, imagine if the effect on the left and the progressive movements, if Bernie Sanders had won in the United States. I mean, it would have given a huge boost to everyone on the left internationally. The opposite has happened in the case of the outcome of the 2015 election. So there's all those aspects of it, and then of course there's the actual military foreign policy, which, despite some of his electoral rhetoric, has seen a sharp turn towards more aggression and more intervention by the US and its allies in various different parts of the world. There's a whole number of statistics that are quite striking and tell the story very clearly. In the first 7 months of the Trump administration, more people died around the world as a result of drone attacks than in the whole 8 years of President Obama's incumbency. And Obama was the president most associated with drones, you know. He was the drone president. And all this is sort of happening, you know, very much under the media radar. Also in terms of just normal, so-called conventional bombing. Over the course of Obama's time in office, his military dropped an average of 12,500 bombs per year in different parts of the world. In Trump's first year in office, his administration has dropped 44,000 bombs, which is, you know, 4 times as many as the average for the Obama years. So, you know, that gives you a sort of a kind of gauge of the extent to which there has been a massive ramping up of US intervention. Most of those bombing attacks took place in Syria and Iraq, but they also happened in other parts of the world as well. So, I mean, that's the kind of gives you some sense of the general picture. On particulars, he's escalated radically in Eastern Europe, where there's been not just a big increase in US and NATO troops, but also a significant ramping up of kind of military manoeuvres, which are extremely provocative and designed to be extremely provocative in terms of challenging Russian influence in parts of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and actually in the kind of southern area, the sort of North Central Asia as well. So, you know, the whole question of kind of NATO expansion is something that, despite his kind of Donald Trump's, you know, apparent scepticism about NATO, nevertheless he has been bolstering that whole operation. The same is true in Afghanistan. I mean, a massive escalation. 16,000 NATO troops are now in Afghanistan. Last year, there were more military, more weapons were used by the West in Afghanistan than at any time since 2012. And 2012 was the last year of the Obama surge in that country. So, you know, that's again a significant ramping up. Which partly is taking place for the same reasons, and one of the reasons actually for the escalation in Eastern Europe, obviously there is a kind of anti-Russian hysteria which is being drummed up, but there's also the question of very important new mineral and oil and gas discoveries in particularly in the Central Asia area of the old Soviet Union or Russian sphere of influence. And I think that's one of the reasons for actually the anti-Russian hysteria. Someone trying to get in through the window. And it's also been one of the drivers of the ramping up in Afghanistan. Then there's the question of Korea, which does come up. And in some sections of the media, some of the more kind of, you know, benighted elements of the media, the negotiations with Kim Jong-un were kind of characterised as being some sign of, I don't know, diplomatic genius on the part of Donald Trump. You know, as kind of somehow he suddenly found his inner peacenik and pulled off a coup for US foreign policy in that region. Actually, I think what happened in Korea was that mainly the North Korean regime, but also the South Korean regime, under pressure from the peace movement, actually, and obviously run now by a kind of relatively moderate social democrat, they took the initiative around the Olympics and managed to sort of create some momentum towards disarmament and towards some talk of peace and negotiation, which was something that the US couldn't control. And actually, I think what's happened is the US hasn't been able to regain the initiative since. And so I think the Pentagon took the decision that despite, and we shouldn't forget, Donald Trump's earlier kind of crazily confrontational rhetoric about Kim Jong-un, where he was talking about, you know, we're going to nuke you, you know, you're dead meat, you know, all the kind of, and all the sort of insults that Trump threw at Kim Jong-un. Despite all that, the Pentagon actually decided that this was a bridge too far, that it wasn't possible to kind of fulfill the promises that Donald Trump had made about the response in that area, and that the US's main allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, actually didn't want confrontation, actually wanted there to be a negotiation, and that is so far what's happened. Having said that, I think there's a number of reasons to be sort of sceptical about this being a kind of any sort of solution. I mean, it is a step forward, actually, and it's a step forward, as I say, that I think has been forced by people in the Korean Peninsula in general. But nevertheless, a number of things, not including the kind of general kind of direction of US foreign policy towards China over the last number of years, where there's been a pivot to the east, there's been an increase in the number of US bases in the Asia Pacific and the South China Sea, and interestingly, the documents that have been released this year by the US kind of foreign policy establishment, which are called the National Security Strategy documents, all of them, and they're worth having a look at actually, or certainly having a look at kind of summaries of them, they do mark quite a significant, at least rhetorical change in US foreign policy, because what they're saying now is that terrorism is no longer the main enemy, non-state actors are no longer the main problem militarily for the US. The main problem, the main competitor, the main enemy is Russia and China. In other words, we are back, even explicitly and openly, they're accepting that we are back to a situation where great power conflict between states is the main driver of US military foreign policy. That's quite a shift, and I think that as well tells you that, you know, the story is not over when it comes to what's going on in Korea and, excuse me, in East Asia generally. If Trump has kind of signed what is, I think, a relatively meaningless nuclear deal in Korea, he has broken what is a real, or what was a real and important nuclear agreement in the Middle East with Iran. And I think the fact that they have scrapped that deal, that the Americans have walked away from that deal, illustrates the truth that, at least when it comes to Middle Eastern foreign policy, the most extreme neocons are now in the driving seat. And we have got this situation now where John Bolton and Mick Pompeo, who are respectively Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, are you know, the main people in charge of foreign policy, apart from Donald Trump. They are real ultras, and particularly John Bolton. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that this guy is back in the driving seat, because he is, he was always on the extreme hawkish end of the neocons, even under in the Bush days. He's someone who openly calls for and continues to call for regime change in Iran, which is it's a massive thing to be calling for. And I think we have to be clear that the ending of the nuclear deal with Iran actually does prove and illustrate the fact that regime change in Iran is now US foreign policy for that country. And unlike the situation in East Asia, America's chief allies in the Middle East are equally committed to regime change in Iran: Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia's kind of allies amongst the Gulf states. They are seriously, all of them, committed to trying to isolate and actually to crush Iran if they can. And so the immediate expression of this actually is escalation, once again, that is going on in the war on Yemen, which is in general being led by Saudi Arabia, although the current escalation is being led by the United Arab Emirates. But they're engaged at the moment in an attack on the main port in Yemen, which is called Hodeidah. And I mean, there's already, Yemen it's chronically underreported. I mean, it's quite a shocking fact, but Yemen is already the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe, an event that has been created by the war. And if they do actually attack Hodeidah or take Hodeidah, you're talking about the main port where all the food comes in, where most of the aid comes in, being taken out. And a situation where even the UN reporter for that region says there is the potential that millions of people will die as a result of that military action. So that is in itself, a massive sort of crisis zone. But it's also illustrates the fact that the Middle East is being kind of divided into two camps, really, into the American camp and the Israeli camp on the one hand, and the Iranian camp with some support from Russia and China on the other. So you're talking about Donald Trump being largely responsible for the possibility of the regionalisation of what is already a war-torn region, the regionalisation of what is already a kind of a region that is involved in a whole series of local wars, which is a terrifying prospect and a terrifying possibility. Obviously, the kind of attacks that have taken place by the Israeli military on the Palestinians, the appalling atrocities where scores of unarmed protesters, peaceful protesters, have just been mowed down in cold blood. That too is an event that has been green-lighted by Trump, and actually by Theresa May as well, really, and is also a product of this kind of increasing polarisation that is taking place in the Middle East. So, I mean, I'm sorry really, because maybe that's why people haven't come, because it is a bleak picture in many ways. It's a seriously dangerous situation, and one thing about the Middle East, just as with some of the other theatres of war, that you're not just talking about the possibility of a regional war, you're talking about a regional war in which the big powers have a stake already. Russia's engaged clearly in Syria, it backs Iran essentially, the US is involved in Syria on the other side, is involved in Iraq, etc., etc. So, it's a powder keg once again. It's an incredibly dangerous situation. And I just want to go on to just make a few general comments about why this is happening, what's driving this kind of increase in conflict or potential conflict. And I think it's important to recognise, and in many ways, one of the key drivers of the whole sort of policy package, if you can call it a package, of the Trump administration, is that the US is facing a whole series of major challenges to its imperial dominance around the world. It's become a kind of cliche, we're moving from a unipolar to a multipolar world, where major competitors are now challenging the US in some of its core areas of interest. And you don't have to be a kind of specialist historian to know that moments where there's a kind of deep geopolitical shift, where the imperial order is being reorganised and rearranged, are very dangerous moments. I mean, they were precisely the sort of general framework that led to the First World War and actually to the Second World War. So that also adds to the sense of impending disaster or catastrophe potentially. Although it is important to emphasise the fact that this is partly about. In a way, this is largely about challenges to US empire. It's largely about the decline of US influence, the decline of America's ability to intervene wherever it wants effectively. And what we've had, and I think what we've had for decades now, is a situation where America's economic weakness is kind of hand in hand with its continued overwhelming military superiority. So you've got this kind of mismatch between an economic, a massive challenge economically. I mean, China will outstrip the US even in just brute, simple GDP terms in 10 years' time. And actually China is also rearming at an accelerating rate, much quicker than most experts thought it would. So, for decades you've had a situation in which the US establishment is more and more tempted to use the military option because of that kind of disjuncture between its military power and its economic power. And I think that process is accelerating. And in a way, that's one way of understanding why Trump is in power and why he's behaving the way he is. I just want to mention two other things about the sort of Trump administration and foreign policy. One is that I think more than any other, certainly recent president, Trump is driven by the desire to keep his base on board. A lot of what he does internationally is kind of an attempt to stay popular at home. And when I'm talking about his base, I'm not just talking about the Republican Party, I'm talking about the hard right within the Republican Party, organised around essentially the Christian fundamentalist and evangelical popular organisations. And I think there is this is something that is a standout characteristic of the Trump administration, that he is very much tied into that base, he's very indebted to that base, he's very kind of close to that base, and he's constantly appeasing that base. And that goes hand in hand with one other thing, which I also think is a, if not unique characteristic of the situation in America, certainly one that we haven't seen for a long time, which is that partly as a result of a kind of political and economic crisis in the US elites and a kind of paralysis, the executive under Trump has much more autonomy and agency. I mean, this is a really frightening thing. This particular erratic, bombastic, deeply reactionary and xenophobic president has more freedom of manoeuvre than I think any president that certainly I can remember in my lifetime. I mean, I think reprobates like Ronald Reagan would have died for the amount of freedom of movement and manoeuvre that Trump has. And so it's not just about his kind of volatile character, although in these circumstances personality do make a difference, but it's also about the fact that he has been able to shape his war cabinet essentially, and that is a worry, and it's also a reason why there's been some debate about this, but I disagree with a thing that Noam Chomsky's been saying recently, which is that Trump is basically a distraction, everything else is going on as usual, he's just a kind of bit of theatre out front of the US ruling class's activity. I don't think that's the case. I mean, there's an element of truth in that, but I think actually the truth is he's not just a kind of social media menace, that he's much more than that, because he is actually making policy in the US and driving it through and getting it enacted. He is actually making decisions about foreign policy, and he is actually managing to get his executive in place, the executive that he wanted to get in place. And so I think to call him a distraction is really a mistake. And I think it's a mistake for another reason, actually, because, and this is where I try and move off the doom and gloom, really, because I think one thing about Donald Trump is that he has generated a huge counter-reaction in the United States itself. Particularly around the recent attacks on migrants, there is an absolute uproar. There's no question about it. There's huge protests and demonstrations. He was forced to back off the actual caging policy, even though a lot of it is still in place, by just a kind of visceral popular upsurging, which included that brilliant moment, I don't know if you saw it, when the Secretary of State for Homeland Security was kind of evicted from a Mexican restaurant by a bunch of activists, which was a very good symbolic moment, but I think that kind of was just the tip of the iceberg of what is a very, very big movement that is developing in the United States against him. Saturday, June the 30th, there's going to be big protests in the US, including a big demonstration in Washington, but also protests and demonstrations in 200 or 300 American towns and cities. And I wouldn't underestimate that. And interestingly, I've been talking and actually listening to quite a few people in the United States at the moment on the left and in the movements, and they're quite confident, funnily enough. Obviously they know they're up against huge challenges, but they are also feeling as if, there is a kind of definitely a sort of polarisation taking place, and partly a polarisation taking place to the left. Some of the statistics are just incredible, that 40% of US millennials self-identify as socialists. That's off the spectrum. The left is growing quite fast. The real left, not just the Democratic Party. for the first time in 40 years, you know, and people saw the shock result in Bronx and Queens, where a 28-year-old socialist took the Democratic primary off one of the most senior Democrats in the whole House. Complete shock, but she is backed by the Democratic Socialists of America. You know, she immediately started talking about the importance of working class politics and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's a very interesting and volatile and unpredictable situation. And I think in the UK, if I'm allowed to call it that, in Scotland, England and Wales, there are signs of, well, I mean, obviously we've got Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, you've had your independent surge, but if you look at the opinion polls in the UK, 78% of people think that Donald Trump is an absolute disaster for the US, a disaster for the US people, a disaster for the image of the US around the world. Only 11% of the population think he's a good president, which must be break all records. I mean, you know, there cannot have been a time when that's happened. Certainly, I mean, possibly in the 19th century at some time, but definitely not in the 20th or the 21st century. So, you know, we're in a very interesting situation where this kind of pariah figure, the most reactionary US president, is kind of rejected on a massive scale, I think, over here at least. And that's, you know, that's in many ways a very favourable situation for us, and it's certainly a situation that we need to exploit to the best of our abilities in the next few weeks. I mean, just to report on London, on the situation in London, I mean, we're expecting a very, very big demonstration on the day he's in town on July the 13th. It's very hard to say, but I mean, there's all sorts of indications of that it's going to be, you know, way beyond the normal demo. We had some internationally famous DJs have called a kind of mass street party occupation of central London, which they're calling Revolution Day, and they're against Trump, and there's bring loudhailers, bring PA systems and everything else you need to start the revolution. It's like, okay. We've had like drag queen organisations get a hold of us and say, we've got 300 people going to be marching with 300 drag queens in full Donald Trump uniform, you know, costume. This is the kind of thing you don't normally get. I mean, you know, it tells you that something quite big is happening, I think. So, I mean, there's plenty of, I mean, the TUC has backed it at the other end of the spectrum in a sense. You know, unions are mobilising, there's coaches coming from across the country. I think it's going to be big. I don't know how big, and I'm not saying February the 15th, 2003 style, but it is going to be, for a weekday demonstration, it is going to be very, very big, which is fantastic. And I think it's important for a number of reasons. I think it will send a message around the world. You know, it's bad that he's been to Paris, he's been to Berlin, he's been to other European capitals without there being this kind of protest. But he's basically already accepted that he can't go out in public in London. So his itinerary is sort of touring the home counties, basically, you know, and then coming up to Scotland. So he can't, I guess he won't go to any urban centres apart from just staying over in London. And so I think it will send a very important message around the world. I think, secondly, it's a way of really having a go and putting on the pressure against what our government, which is an extremely, obviously vicious, but also very vulnerable government. And, you know, I think it'll play appallingly badly for May that she's rolling out the red carpet for him. And, you know, so it can damage her as well and her government, which is important. And then finally, I think, I mean, there's lots of other reasons, but I mean, one other important reason is it's quite clear that even in Britain, there are attempts by the far right to reorganise and to get back into the streets. And we had the Tommy Robinson demonstration a few weeks ago. Nothing sends a clearer message to those people than that there is a very, very big mobilisation against their hero. You know, this is important. This will be a big knockback for them. There's also a demonstration the following. They're trying to mobilise on the 14th, actually, in London, the far right. There's also going to be a counter-demonstration. But, I mean, if we get, you know, anything like 50 or 100,000 people in the streets in London the day before, that's going to dwarf what the far right can deliver. And I think that will be a very important blow for the left. I mean, we've got a big demonstration in London on Saturday over the NHS, which will be very big and very good as well. But have an NHS demo, then 2 weeks later a massive demonstration against Trump. And I think what has been a bit of a lacklustre year for the left can suddenly turn into something quite exciting and quite reinvigorating. So I think all that is very important. I mean, obviously Jonathan's hopefully going to come, and I'm sure all of you know way more than I do about what's happening in Scotland, obviously. But I do have to say that I remember the fantastic demonstration in Edinburgh in 2004, was it, or 5? 5, yeah.
G8.
Yeah, the G8, and the brilliant thing you organised at Gleneagles, where you got 5,000 people out into the country and so forth and so on. And I mean, you know, I have every confidence, having talked to Pete and others, that, you know, you're going to have some fantastic protests here as well. And that will be fantastic. I mean, hopefully we're going to... I mean, there is actually in Britain a very, very good and proud tradition of driving out tyrants and dictators and reactionaries of various different kinds. Whether you want to talk about George Bush's visit in 2003, where we had 300,000 people out on the streets on a weekday, whether you want to talk about Condoleezza Rice, who we definitely chased around the country the next year when she came over, going right back to Pinochet, when Pinochet was in the country, and you know, we had protests day in, day out on a week. People say, why are you doing it on the Friday? We're doing it on the Friday because that is the day when he's doing business with Theresa May and with the Queen. If you know, I don't know if that's business, it kind of is. Whatever. And it's very important that we don't just wait for the weekend, and that we do actually say to people, you've got to take the day off work. I mean, obviously not everyone can, but in reality, most people can, in my opinion. So, you know, they're saying, well, actually, no, you're doing it in the evening, aren't you, the 13th? But anyway, that's what we're saying in London. Because we want, when he's meeting Theresa May, wherever he's meeting, we're going to protest wherever he's meeting them. But we also want to be clear that, you know, that we're going out on the day he is here, because we want to make sure that he can't be normalised in this country, that he can't get into London, that he can't go to Downing Street, that he can't go to Buckingham Palace. And I think that's a very important thing, and it is, as I say, in a kind of proud tradition of the British Labour movement and the other movements beyond that. And in a way, it's possible to argue that, you know, of all of those events, of all of those times when we've attacked and challenged and confronted tyrants, this actually may be the most important of all. So for us, you know, there's an absolute frenzy of activity going on in the whole, well, actually in lots of places around the country, not just in London, because we do, I mean, I do think it matters. I think this is a very significant moment, potentially a historic moment. If we can create a situation where London, at least, is a no-go area, and certainly the other big cities are no-go areas for Donald Trump, the leader of the free world, so-called, that would be a big, big prize to win, and something that I think will be very, very important. So, I think that.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris.